everyone, we're from Group 7 and we would like to present our project presentation entitled School's Report Book. First of all, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Kofial Fatah Derojat.
Hi, my name is Ashifa Zuani.
Hello, my name is Farhanuddin Prasetyo.
In this presentation, we will discuss about what is report book, entity relationship diagram or ERD, normalization, and SQL.
First is, what is report book? A book report is an essay discussing the content of a book written as part of class assignment issued to students in school. There is a difference between a book report and a book review. A report includes a larger outline, and a review stays on the topic of the book. Teacher frequently give students a list of books from which they may choose one for the report, although sometimes students may select a work entirely of their own choosing. Teachers may set the list of books through such method as including the works of one particular author, reading multiple works to students aloud, and having each student select one of the books for the report, or choosing the books through a class selection process. The content of the book report for a work of fiction typically include basic bibliographical information about the work, a summary of the narrative and setting, main element of the story of key characters, the author's purpose in creating the work, the student's opinion of the book, and a theme statement summing up the main idea drawn from a reading of the book. Next is our ERD. In our ERD, there's a student. In the student, there's ID student, name student, student gender, birthday, student phone number, and religion. For the primary key in ID student. And there's a teacher. In teacher, there is a ID teacher as primary key, name teacher, teacher payroll, teacher gender, teacher status, teacher subject, and teacher phone number. Teacher and student take a subject. In the subject, there's a ID subject as primary key, name subject, curriculum, and ID teacher. Subject get a score. In score, there's a ID score as a primary key, ID student as a primary key, name subject, final term, midterm, and quiz score. From score, have a report. In the report, there's a ID student, ID teacher, ID score, and ID subject. And last, there's a ID report as a primary.
Normalization. This is an example of normalization from student data table. There is 1NF and 2NF. In 2NF, we can see that student ID is declared as primary key for student data table.
Okay, I will explain about our SQL from diagram table. For the first table, on the first table, there is a student table and there is one primary key, namely student ID, and there are several columns or attributes including student name, student gender, student birthday, student phone number, and the last column is student religion. And the next table is the teacher table. And in the teacher table, there is one primary key, namely teacher ID, and there are also several columns, namely teacher name, teacher gender, teacher status, teacher phone number, and teacher payroll. And the third table from our SQL is the subject data table. In the subject data, there is one primary key, namely subject ID, and there are several columns, namely name subject, teacher ID, and curriculum. And the fourth table, namely score data, and there is one primary key, namely score ID, and one column student subject. And the fifth table, namely the student score table, and there is one primary and column, student ID and student name. And the last table is report table. But we divide the two tables because there are too many columns and attributes into two, namely report data and detail data report. In the data report, there is one column and one primary key, namely student ID and report ID. While on the report data detail, while on the report data detail, there are four primary key, namely report ID, teacher ID, subject ID, and score ID, and one column, namely status score. Okay, now I will explain about design and validation. For the first table, uh, namely student. On the student, F column, student ID and data type varchar with 100 and description ID student, validation student ID, method used for validation, primary key not known. On the second column is the student name. For the data type varchar with 100, description student name, validation student name, method used for validation not known. On the third column, student gender, data type varchar with 100, description student gender, validation student gender, method used for validation constraint check. For the fourth column, student birthday, data type date with none, description student birthday, validation student birthday, method used for validation not known. Fourth column, student phone number, data type varchar with 100, description student phone number, validation student phone number, method used for validation not known. For the last column, student religion, data type varchar with 100, description student religion, validation student religion, method used for validation not known. On the second table, there's a teacher table. On the first column, teacher ID, data type varchar with 100, description ID teacher, validation teacher ID, method used for validation, primary key not known. Second column, teacher name, data type varchar with 100, description teacher name, validation teacher name, method used for validation not known. And third column, teacher gender, data type varchar with 100, description teacher gender, validation teacher gender, method used for validation constraint check not known. Column, for the fourth column, teacher status, data type varchar with 100, description teacher status, validation teacher status, method used for validation constraint check not known. For the fourth column, teacher phone number, data type char with 100, description teacher phone number, validation teacher phone number, method used for validation not known. Column, for the last column, payroll teacher, data type varchar with 100, description teacher payroll, validation payroll teacher, method used for validation not known. For the third table, there is score data table. For the first column, score ID, data type varchar with 100, description score ID, validation score ID, method used for validation primary key not known. For the last column, student subject, data type varchar with 100, description student subject, validation student subject, method used for validation not known. For the fourth table, there is student score table. For the first column, student ID, data type varchar with 100, description ID student, validation student ID, method used for validation constraint check not known. Column, For the second column, student name, data type varchar with 100, description student name, validation student name, method used for validation, primary key not known. For the fifth table, there's report data. For the first column for report data table is report ID, data type varchar with 100, description report ID, validation report ID, method used for validation, primary key not known. Second column, student ID, data type varchar by 100, student description student ID, validation student ID, method used for validation, concern check not known. Design and validation for the last table is report data detail. For the first column, there's report ID, data type varchar with 100, description ID report, validation report ID, method used for validation, constraint foreign key and primary key not known. Column teacher for the report data detail, second column is teacher ID, data type varchar with 100, description ID teacher, validation teacher ID, constraint primary key, foreign key not known. For the third column is subject ID, data type varchar with 100, description ID subject, validation subject ID, method used for validation, constraint primary key, foreign key, constraint primary key and foreign key not known. Column for the fourth column, score ID, data type varchar with 100, description ID score, validation score ID, constraint primary key and foreign key not known. And the for last column is status score, data type varchar with 100, description status score, validation status score, method used for validation not known. And thank you for your attention. This is our project. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.